Hello and welcome to Realpolitik Confidential. Today it is the 23rd of June 2025 and I'm your host Alex Crișan. Today's episode is titled Persian Spring, the season of rising lions and revolutions. Welcome to Realpolitik Confidential. Since our last episode, Empires of the Sea, which focused on the twilight of maritime freedom, events have unfolded with a ferocity that even we did not fully anticipate. The Strait of Hormuz, arguably the most strategic bottleneck in the global energy system, is now at risk of partial or full closure. A series of military escalations between Israel and Iran, culminating in Operation Rising Lion, has sent the region hurtling towards a critical juncture. And with it, we must now ask, is this the beginning of the end for the Islamic Republic of Iran? Tonight's question is simple but volatile. Could Iran be on the brink of a new revolution? The ingredients are all there. A battered economy, a fragmented and restless society, and now foreign bombs falling on Iranian soil. But before we speculate, let us ground ourselves in the reality of what Iran is and what it has been. Iran at a glance is quite a bouquet to analyze. With nearly 92 million citizens, Iran is the 17th most populous country on earth. Its GDP hovers around 480 billion US dollars, but don't be fooled by that figure. Poverty runs deep. According to the Bertelsmann Transformation Index, more than 65 million Iranians live below the poverty line. This is happening in a country which once held the title of the crown jewel of the Persian civilization. Literacy sits at 89%, median age is around 33, and nearly 4 in 5 Iranians live in the cities. But that youthful urban demographic tells us a story far more subversive than any macroeconomic indicator can capture. This is a society where the average citizen is young, wired, disillusioned, and most importantly, angry. What kind of regime rules this country, you might ask? Well, if you haven't been living under a rock, you know that Iran is an Islamic republic, but not in the way liberal democracies call themselves republics. It is a theocracy light, where clerics control the judiciary, the military, and most importantly, the supreme leader who outranks the president and answers to no ballot box. It is not a monolith. Factions inside the regime squabble and sabotage, but all power flows upwards towards one man, and currently that man's name is Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who has ruled the country with an iron grip since 1989. The ethnic composition of Iran is also far from being uniform. We have 69% Persians, almost 16% Azerbaijani, and almost 10% Kurdish people, with minorities like the Baloch, the Lurs, the Arabs, and the Turkmen rounding out the mix. Religiously, Iran is over 90% Shia Muslim. But don't let the unity of faith mislead you. This is a country cracked by ethnic, sectarian, and linguistic fissures. When we look at the economic reality, Iran ranks fourth in proven oil reserves and second in natural gas. That should make it rich. Instead, years of US and UN sanctions, plus mind-boggling economic mismanagement, have strangled its economy. Inflation is rampant, to say the least. And so is youth unemployment, especially among graduates. Chronic unemployment among graduates is one of the key issues here. The rial is worth less than digital dust these days, so that also counts for something. Oil and gas make up the overwhelming bulk of exports and state revenue. The revenue has gone into ballistic missiles, proxy militias, and ideological wars across the region, from Beirut to Baghdad to Sana'a, but very little has trickled back to the average Iranian. That's why every economic shock, every fuel price hike, every subsidy cut turns political within days. When it comes to strategic geography, Iran's strategic position is unrivaled. It controls the northern coast of the Persian Gulf and dominates the Strait of Hormuz, through which nearly 20% of the world's oil passes. It borders Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Turkey, placing it at the nerve center of Eurasian power projection. But this geography is a double-edged sword. It makes Iran indispensable to the global energy architecture, but also highly vulnerable to internal collapse or external pressure. Its proxies, Hezbollah, the Iraqi militias, Syrian irregulars, and Houthi rebels, have been carefully cultivated to project asymmetric deterrence. But now, under Israeli bombardment and rising internal dissent, even those assets might not be enough to hold the system together. Iran's youth bulge is its biggest demographic reality. Over 60% of Iranians are under 39 years old. They've grown up under sanctions, surveillance, and sermons, but also under Instagram, VPNs, and encrypted chats. These are not rural zealots. I cannot stress this enough. Iran is as far from Afghanistan as you can imagine. These are secular, learning, globalized, educating young people who know what Paris looks like and want a version of it in Tehran. And they've tried to achieve it before. In 1999, student protests over press freedom erupted. In 2009, the Green Movement was born from electoral fraud. From 2017 to 2018, the protests sparked by a currency collapse occurred. And in 2019, bloody riots over fuel prices ended up in almost 1,500 people losing their lives reportedly. In 2022, most recently, we had the Women, Life and Freedom protests, which were ignited by the brutal murder of Mahsa Amini. Each of these uprisings carried the same chant: death to the dictator. And each was met with the same tools: internet blackouts, rubber bullets, mass arrests, and occasionally live ammunition. But what sets 2025 apart? Well, the answer is coming out of Israel, of all places. That answer is Operation Rising Lion, which we tackled before in episode 5, if I'm not mistaken. Operation Rising Lion was a military conflict led over years of domestic discontent. Israeli F-35s lighting up nuclear and IRGC targets across Iran. US naval support quietly backing the airstrikes, and most recently using B-2 Spirit bombers to fully destroy 3 Iranian nuclear sites. We have civilian deaths, we have cyber attacks, and now blackouts, street patrols, and a gnawing sense that the walls are closing in. The question this episode will explore is not simply whether the regime can survive. The real question is, has Iran reached its breaking point? And if so, who rises, who falls, and what comes next? This is Realpolitik Confidential. Let us begin. To understand the tremors shaking Iran today, we must trace the tectonic lines beneath its surface. Lines etched by millennia of glory, conquest, revolution, and repression. This is not just a modern crisis, it is a collision between ancient memory and modern despair. Let us look at ancient Persia, the imperial birthright of Iran. Long before it became a pariah in the eyes of the West, Iran was the cradle of civilization. The Achaemenid Empire, founded by Cyrus the Great in the 6th century before Christ, was not just a kingdom. It was the world's first true superpower. Stretching from the Indus to the Aegean, it introduced concepts like human rights, religious tolerance, and postal systems centuries ahead of its time. Cyrus, still revered today in modern Iran, was more than a conqueror. He was a lawgiver, a unifier, and according to legend, chosen by the Zoroastrian god Ahura Mazda himself. Under the Achaemenids, Zoroastrianism, a monotheistic, fire-worshipping religion, became state doctrine. This religion, being one of the oldest in human history, has still a minority of practitioners even to this day. But all of this was about to change. In the year 330 before Christ, Alexander the Great torched Persepolis and toppled the empire. Persia's dominance ended, but Persian identity never really died. Through the Seleucid, the Parthian, and the Sassanid empires, Iranian language and culture remained, and it managed to do so almost entirely unchanged, embedding itself in everything from literature to court protocol. Even the Islamic Caliphate, which would later conquer it, wouldn't erase what Cyrus had started. In the 7th century Anno Domini, Arab Muslim armies surged out of the Arabian Peninsula and overran Sassanid Persia. The Zoroastrian priesthood was shattered, temples were destroyed, and Islam was imposed. Yet here lies one of history's great paradoxes. While Persia fell to Islam, Islam rose through Persia. By the 10th century, Persian poets like Ferdowsi and philosophers like Ibn Sina, or Avicenna as he is known in Latin texts, shaped Islamic civilization. Even as most Persians converted, they infused the religion with their own mysticism, metaphysics, and aesthetics. This created a distinct Persian Islamic identity, proud, poetic, and subtly resistant to Arab dominance. By the 16th century, under the native dynasties, Persia had become the spiritual leader of Shiite Islam. Shiite Islam is a divergence from the Sunni world that would later underpin modern geopolitical fault lines. Then we have the Safavid and the Qajar era, Shiism, sovereignty and subjugation being the name of the game. The Safavid dynasty, which ruled Iran from 1501 to 1722, made Shiism the state religion of Iran and institutionalized it through seminaries, shrines, and clerical courts. It was a cultural renaissance of art, architecture, and theology alike. But after the empire's fall, chaos followed. Enter the Qajar dynasty, which ruled from 1794 to 1925. The Qajar dynasty unified the territory of modern-day Iran, but it all came at a price. By the 19th century, Iran was a pawn in the great game between Russia and Britain. The 1907 Anglo-Russian Convention sliced the country into zones of influence. Yet in 1906, a spark. Protests forced the Qajars to accept a constitution and a parliament. This was an early experiment in constitutional monarchy, but power remained with the Shah, and the experiment soon collapsed under both royalist and foreign pressure. Enter the Pahlavi monarchy, or as I like to put it, modernization with an iron fist. In 1925, a military officer named Reza Khan overthrew the Qajars and became Reza Shah Pahlavi. And he westernized Iran at breakneck speed. Railroads, universities, conscription, and brutal secularism were the name of the game. He banned the hijab, he weakened the clerics, he made Persian nationalism the state ideology. But Reza Shah was no democrat. And when World War II broke out, the British and the Soviets forced him to abdicate in favor of his son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. The young Shah's reign was turbulent. In 1951, Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh nationalized Iran's oil, which was previously controlled by British interests. To the surprise of absolutely no one, the West responded with Operation Ajax, which was a CIA MI6 joint operation coup, which in 1953 toppled Mossadegh and restored full power to the Shah. From then on, modernization came at gunpoint. Land reform, women's rights, and industrialization were imposed from above. But so were censorship, secret police, and a cult of personality. The contradiction grew sharper by the 1970s. Iranian cities glowed with neon and grew rich and fat on oil wealth. But, meanwhile, the rural poor festered, and the bazaars and clerics seethed. In 1979, disaster struck. The Islamic Revolution had arrived. This was a matter of faith against the modern state. In 1978, the social contract was finally shattered in Iran. This was sparked by inflation, repression, and exiled cleric Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. Mass protests engulfed the country, and in January 1979, the Shah fled. By February, the monarchy was no more. What followed was a revolutionary hybrid, an Islamic republic, which was ratified by referendum, ruled by a supreme leader, under a concept called Velayat-e-Faqih, or the guardianship of the jurist. Clerics now stood above presidents and parliaments, mediating between the divine law and the state's power. Iraq pivoted from pro-Western to anti-Western overnight. US embassies were seized, and the word Satan entered national rhetoric. A new era had begun, one in which faith would be fused with the fires of geopolitics. And, speaking of fire, in the 1980s, the baptism of fire arrived. By that I mean the Iran-Iraq War. Barely a year into the revolution, Iraq's Saddam Hussein invaded, hoping to snuff out the new regime. What followed was 8 years of absolute bloodbath, which later came to be known as the Iran-Iraq War. 500,000 dead, chemical weapons, child soldiers, and trench warfare were the reality on the ground. It was Iran's own Vietnam, but also its crucible. The war galvanized nationalism, legitimized the Revolutionary Guard, and planted the seeds of Iran's regional doctrine, which is asymmetric warfare through proxies. And when the guns fell silent in 1988, Iran was battered, but ideologically hardened. Now we head towards the 1990s and the early 2000s, where reform, re-entrenchment, and resistance were the main characteristic of the era. The death of Khomeini in 1989 brought Ali Khamenei to power. He was a lesser cleric elevated to the rank of supreme leader of Iran. In the 1990s, pragmatic presidents like Rafsanjani and later Khatami sought reconstruction and modest liberalization. Newspapers flourished, women's rights advanced, and the youth began to breathe once more. But hardliners within the judiciary, the IRGC, and the clerical elite pushed back. In 2005, the pendulum swung the other way indefinitely. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, a populist hardliner, took office. His second term, won amid allegations of fraud, triggered the 2009 Green Movement, where millions took to the streets chanting, "Where is my vote?" and "Death to the dictator." The regime cracked down with brutal efficiency. The movement was crushed and the internet was censored. Reform was declared dead. Then we have the Rouhani interlude and Raisi's rise. In 2013, moderate cleric Hassan Rouhani was elected president on a promise of nuclear detente. In 2015, Iran signed the JCPOA, halting its nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief. But in 2018, President Donald Trump pulled the US out of the deal, sanctions returned, and the economy tanked. Trust was a currency which rapidly evaporated. By 2020, hardliners had regained control of parliament. In 2021, the judiciary's enforcer, Ebrahim Raisi, became president. His rule was austere, repressive, and deeply unpopular. Then, in 2024, Raisi died suddenly in a helicopter crash. His death triggered political chaos and, surprise, surprise, the election of Masoud Pezeshkian, a conservative turned centrist backed by reformist factions. But remember, the presidency in Iran is not supreme. The supreme leader still calls the shots, and Khomeini remains alive, though frail. Then came the uprisings, waves of rage, which systematically came to Iran. Iran's modern history, as we mentioned in the introduction, from 1999, where student protests over press censorship erupted, to the 2022 Mahsa Amini protests, which were about her being killed by the morality police and the cry of woman, life and freedom echoing around the world. Each wave of protests was leaderless, decentralized and brutally suppressed. But each left scars on the regime's legitimacy and embers beneath the ash. The CSIS in 2019 report concluded that Iran's protests lacked three ingredients necessary for revolution: a unified leadership, elite defection, and security force disintegration. And yet, those embers have never really gone cold. Now we return to the modern day. Iran in 2025 stands at the nexus of its many contradictions. We have ancient empire versus modern authoritarianism. We have theocratic rigidity versus youthful liberalism. We have ideological paranoia versus cosmopolitan aspiration. The Iranian people have risen many times, but the regime has survived each blow. The question now, after Operation Rising Lion and Operation Midnight Hammer, after blackouts, missile strikes, and after Mahsa Amini, plus 1,000 other names of women, men and dissidents being crushed by a criminal regime, the real question is this: will the next wave finally wash the Islamic Republic away? Now we will address our second segment, Operation Rising Lion, or lighting the fuse. No revolution begins in a vacuum. It begins with fire, with noise, with an event that shatters routine and scrambles the brain. And that event for Iran may have arrived under the name of Operation Rising Lion. For months, Israeli intelligence has been quietly preparing covert drone placements, electronic mapping of Iran's air defenses, psychological operations on social media platforms. But on a humid night in mid-June 2025, the quiet finally ended. Without formal declaration or fanfare, dozens of explosive drones pre-positioned inside Iranian territory rose from their caches and slammed into radar arrays, anti-air batteries, and command nodes across central and southern Iran. Within hours, Israeli F-35I Adir stealth fighters slid through Iranian airspace and delivered high-precision bunker busters to nuclear sites, ballistic missile bases, and IRGC headquarters. The codename of the operation was Rising Lion, but its message was the Islamic Republic must bleed. Israeli officials called it a campaign of strategic degradation. Senior analysts called the operation the most comprehensive military strike against Iran since the Iran-Iraq war. The results were immediate and staggering. Over 100 confirmed targets struck, at least 20 missile bases rendered inoperable, several senior commanders of the IRGC Quds Force and Air Defense Divisions, all of them gone. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was clear. This was not merely retaliation. This was a message to the Iranian people. Your regime is vulnerable. Your liberation possible. Make no mistake, this was not a punitive raid. It was a coordinated multi-domain offensive, part air war, part psychological campaign, and part geopolitical gambit. The regime's response was shock, fire, and silence. Iran's retaliation was predictable, but limited in its impact. Hundreds of drones and missiles were launched towards Israeli territory, many from proxy bases in Iraq or Syria. Iron Dome batteries and David Sling intercepted the vast majority. Tel Aviv's skyline held, just barely. But inside Iran, the real story unfolded. Within hours, the regime cut off mobile networks and internet access across most provinces. Access Now, the global digital rights watchdog, reported that nationwide connectivity collapsed to 3 to 5% of baseline. Satellite dishes were jammed, international media blocked, and foreign correspondents were expelled. And then, a symbolic rupture occurred. Iranian state television, which was earlier struck by Israeli missiles, was hacked. For 10 glorious minutes, millions of viewers watched as protests, slogans, and angry men flooded the screen. Rise up. This is your moment. That to the dictator was the message. For a regime built on narrative control, this was as devastating as the American and Israeli missiles were. The foreign ministry called it an Israeli-American war against truth. But the regime's own actions told the real story. Arrests, curfews, armed checkpoints in Tehran, and the IRGC on high alert. In public, Iran projected defiance. In private, it was rattled. It is safe to assume that Iran's leadership is currently in full panic mode. The cracks within the state are visible. For decades, Iran's leadership prided itself on internal cohesion. Yes, there were some reformists and hardliners. Yes, presidents came and went. But the deep state, the IRGC, the Supreme Leader Office, and the Ministry of Intelligence stood as a singular, monolithic fortress. Rising Lion cracked that illusion, and Midnight Hammer made sure that illusion stayed dead. Reports, still unverified but persistent, suggests serious rifts opened within the regime in the first 72 hours. Some in the military allegedly blamed the civilian leadership for failing to anticipate Israeli capabilities. Others within the Basij militia were said to be angered by the lack of air support or clear orders. According to a Tehran-based researcher interviewed by Associated Press, command communications had all collapsed in the critical early hours. Even top field units were left positively blind. Unable to confirm which installations had been hit or whether Tehran itself had fallen. It was truly under the imperium of the fog of war all across Iran. And all this happened under a full digital blackout. No way to text, tweet or call. Just the echo of falling bombs and the buzz of military vehicles in the streets. We can truly talk about a digital siege and the isolation of an entire nation. The communications blackout wasn't just strategic, it was psychological. Iranians, already conditioned to expect lies from state media, now had no way to verify anything. Rumors of a decapitated leadership of Israeli special forces in Isfahan or of Khomeini's fleeing to Mashdad, none confirmed, all of them psychologically terrifying to the citizenry. But outside the regime's control, a digital resistance was already there. Using smuggled Starlink terminals, rooftop VPNs and encrypted radio apps, Iranians began to reconnect with the world. Clips of explosions, messages of solidarity, calls to protests. The psychological impact of this blackout plus blitz was profound. Paranoia surged, faith in government, already fragile, nosedived. The economic aftershocks soon came. The crash had arrived. The Tehran stock exchange, which was always negligible, had tumbled. The rial collapsed further against the dollar, food prices soared as delivery networks froze under fuel rationing, and chaos was the name of the game. But Iranians are not new to hardship. Every time Tehran's regime promised stability through sacrifice, be it 2009, 2019 or 2020, every time it ended in blood. Let us be clear, Operation Rising Lion and America's subsequent operation called Midnight Hammer exposed the vulnerabilities of Iran. And it was also a shock to the regime's nervous system. It amplified dissent, and most dangerously, it revived the hope that the Islamic Republic might one day fall. Israel didn't just target nuclear facilities or bunkers, it targeted the majesty of the IRGC and of the Ayatollah's office. It targeted a system which used fear and indoctrination to keep people in line all across a nation of 92 million. Israel shattered that. Israel and America managed to show the cracks within this theocratic regime. And how deep the cracks go, and if the cracks will become rifts, time will only tell. Another factor which we must take into account is the fact that a Pahlavi still lives. The Crown Prince, the heir to the crown of Iran, is still alive and kicking. And he lives in the West. And he smells opportunity. We have noticed that he has started regularly communicating both on social media and in the conventional press. This has been silently backed by Western forces and by the Iranian diaspora, which is estimated to sit somewhere at around 4 to 5 million people worldwide. They have long been a force in exile. Wealthy Iranians in California, political Iranians in Paris, pensive Iranians in Berlin, and enraged Iranians in Istanbul. But over the past year, it has become something else entirely, this digital diaspora. It has become a digital logistic core for a potential revolution. In the weeks leading up to the following Operation Rising Lion, Iranian tech workers in Silicon Valley, Stockholm, Toronto, and Paris have quietly mobilized, not with guns or slogans, but with code. Custom VPNs deployed on private servers, smuggled Starlink kits offering limited satellite access inside Iran, Elon Musk's network being open all across the skies, of the Islamic Republic. Encrypted communication apps built from scratch, tailor-made to evade Iran's firewalls. All of this are rumored to have been the tools in which the Iranian diaspora has employed in order to help their people at home. And while Google, Meta and Apple have treaded cautiously, fearful of US Treasury sanctions, the diaspora collectives have filled the void. They've managed to raise through subversive means digital literacy, anti-censorship tutorials and emergency tech support for organizers on the ground. It's quiet, it's decentralized and it's profoundly subversive. In a regime that fears free communication more than foreign bombs, this is a new battlefield. Then we have the media war and the foreign hand narrative. On Western screens, Iran is once again the face of rebellion. People protesting outside the Iranian embassy in London. Messages of support from the Crown Prince. Messages of support from secular Iranians which fled and now have second-generation children which are Western citizens with Western values and Western education. The question remains, could this be Iran's Arab Spring? There is no doubt that there is a certain Western-covered support, especially now that President Trump has begun talking openly about regime change. But that doesn't make the struggle of the Iranian people less important. All nations have the right to democracy, but we must be very careful that we have seen how the road to hell is paved with good intentions in the Middle East, time and time again. From Libya to Iraq, from Syria to Afghanistan. Need to be remarkably careful and always think of the day after the revolution. How could this actually work in 2025? Well, gone are the days of megaphones in town squares. Today's Iranian protests are digitally native, decentralized, and ruthlessly adaptive. Despite the regime's sophisticated digital repression tools, deep packet inspections, national DNS firewalls, and state-licensed ISPs, Iranians have learned to outmaneuver them. Telegram, Instagram, and WhatsApp remain the platforms of choice. Protesters use mesh networks, offline maps, Bluetooth-based group chats, which were originally thought to be ways of resistant media blackouts during, well, let's say, the Iranian regime's more troubled times. Since 2009, Iran has invested in building a halal internet, a controlled cyberspace designed to throttle dissent. In moments of crisis like November 2019 or June 2025, they'll pull the plug. But even then, a resistance can still bloom. USB sticks, passing videos, satellite phones circulating in black markets, and from abroad, the diaspora filling the void, relaying news, fact-checking rumors, and archiving the abuses. It is not a centralized movement, but it is a swarm that is both chaotic and improvised, and also terribly persistent. The question remains though, does the West want this? Does the West want the Iranian regime toppled? Or does the West fear it? Let's look at the geopolitical reality in order to try and find an answer to that. The US wants to curb Iran's nuclear program and militia networks. Europe wants a return to the JCPOA and Iranian oil flows. Israel wants regime collapse, full stop. And the Gulf monarchies, such as Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates, quietly hope that Iran bleeds, but not so much that it floods in the entire region. Many in Washington and Brussels speak the language of liberty, but remember, when Mubarak fell in Egypt, the West panicked. When Assad nearly fell in Syria, the West froze. When Gaddafi was toppled, the West bombed and then abandoned. So despite the speeches and think tank op-eds, most Western governments want a weak Iran. I repeat that, a weak Iran. Toppling the regime without a viable alternative could ignite sectarian war, regional collapse, refugee waves, and oil shock. So far, the West's tools have been sanctions, which crippled, but often indiscriminately, cyber attacks, both covert and deniable, information support, which was diaspora driven. But no tanks, no invasions, and no smoking gun, and unless Khamenei drops dead tomorrow, or an Israeli or American missile hits his bunker, that's unlikely to change. The question is, can the opposition win? And is there an opposition? Let's be brutally honest. Iran's opposition is not unified. It is not organized, and it is most importantly not inside Iran. You've got monarchists waving the pre-1979 flag, adored in Los Angeles, but ignored in Tehran. You have reformists, which are discredited by years of failed appeasement. You have leftist students whose dreams rarely reach rural provinces. You have ethnic separatists such as the Kurds, the Baloch, and the Arab, and even the Azerbaijani, who burn with rage but lack nationwide reach. And then we have the People Mujahideen, or the MAK, once powerful but now exiled and hated even by fellow dissidents. When the streets erupt, it's often in Kurdistan, or in Sistan Baluchistan, or in Ahvaz, all regions which feel colonized by Tehran. But there's no central command whatsoever, no singular unifying figure to rally behind. And revolutions require three things: unity of purpose, split with the elites, and cracks in the security apparatus. Iran has the fire, but does it have the fuse? What would be the cost of the revolution going terribly wrong? What would be the cost of collapse? Well, it would be a strategic and humanitarian nightmare. Let's imagine just for a moment that the regime falls. Then what? Experts warn that the collapse of the Islamic Republic could unleash a refugee crisis dwarfing Syria's. Estimates range from 20 to 30 million people being displaced. Azerbaijan might absorb ethnic Azeris, Iraq could spiral if Shiite militias fracture, Afghanistan might be swarmed by border chaos, and Turkey would face a second refugee wave, this time not from Syria, but from Iran. Meanwhile, Iran's nuclear infrastructure, its centrifuges, enriched uranium and missile platforms, if still intact, could fall into unknown hands. Which could mean anything. They could be warlords, insurgents, foreign powers. And who intervenes if that happens? Russia, to protect its economic assets? China, to secure its oil infrastructure? Or the US to seize the nuclear material? It's a nightmare game of who blinks first. Even if civil war doesn't break out, a prolonged insurgency or power vacuum could destabilize the entire Middle East, ignite Sunni-Shia conflict, and throw global energy markets into paralysis. So the question is the following: is Israel and the West pulling the strings? Well, I doubt that. Not because they wouldn't want to, just because it's remarkably difficult to do that in such a complicated nation as Iran. But they are fanning the flames. They are absolutely fanning the flames. Diaspora engineers, signal boosts from London and DC, strategic leaks and encouraging rhetoric. All this movement needs is a unifying leader, even though it's not made in Tel Aviv, nor is it made in Langley, or Westminster for that matter. If it's going to be made in Tehran, in Mashdad, in Sanadaj, or in Zahedan, it would need to be made by people with memories of martyrs and no illusions about messiahs. Here at Realpolitik we say this: revolutions are not bought, they are bled into being. And if Iran's Persian spring is coming, it will not be because of the West. It will be because the regime rotted from within and the people refused to bow. Now, let us explore a number of scenarios about this terrifying question. The first scenario is the best case scenario and the most unlikely. In this ideal scenario, Iran negotiates a form of transition. Under intense internal pressure and perhaps international mediation, the regime could agree to reforms, for example, allowing fair elections or a referendum on the constitution. A new government, whether a secular republic or a reformed theocracy, could emerge without widespread violence. Some diaspora monarchists flirt with the idea of a symbolic constitutional monarchy, such as the one in Malaysia or in Morocco, but polling suggests most young Iranians have little nostalgia for the Shah. More likely, a republic would take shape. Not necessarily an Islamic one. Perhaps one with power sharing between moderate clerics and elected politicians. Such an outcome could stabilize the region. Iran might even re-enter global markets, selling oil openly, reduce support for its foreign militias and shift towards detente. Gulf tensions might ease, oil tankers could sail freely, and US confrontation would de-escalate. Critically, this requires hardliners in Tehran to step aside. And I cannot stress how important this is, outside powers to offer an orderly path forward, something many Western leaders say they have not yet planned, but it remains the most optimistic possibility. We are not blind at the risk of nation building, as it has rarely ever worked. But all that we are saying is that this is the best case scenario that we could possibly imagine. Then we have the middle case, enduring unrest. This is by far a more plausible outcome. Prolonged instability without outright collapse. The regime could survive a severe crackdown but emerge severely weakened. For example, large-scale protests might force concessions on some social issues such as easing dress codes, releasing political prisoners, or reshuffling hardline politicians. The system would remain that of the Islamic Republic in name alone, but with degraded legitimacy. Iran would face renewed economic sanctions, especially if foreign companies fear instability, and continued Western distrust. The fighting might subside into cycles, some protests, some reforms, but no clear victory for either side. This is akin to the status quo after previous upheavals, a brittle accommodation, and in the middle scenario, Iran would stay within its current political order, only with parts of society being more disillusioned and potentially more active in their opposition networks underground. Oil exports would stay subdued, Western companies reluctant to invest, and regional security would remain tense, but not in a full-scale war. This stagnant stalemate, and not even a modest win, neither for the revolutionaries nor for the regime. It would rather be a protracted low-grade conflict. The worst-case scenario for Iran is truly involved in American intervention. If Iran decides to disproportionately hit American and Western targets, for example, the aircraft carrier USS Nimitz, which is right now in the Persian Gulf, this would spark an escalation on both sides. You would see American bombing campaigns running out of targets in the military sense and going after strategic infrastructure of a civilian nature in order to put pressure on Tehran. This would result in further retaliation, in proxy attacks, in terror attacks all across the West, or perhaps in Israel or Western allies. This would spiral out of control until the Americans would be forced by the Trump administration, who would feel that they are losing face, to put boots on the ground. The moment the Americans put boots on the ground, the situation gets severely tangled up. It would quickly become America's second Vietnam. This is truly a nightmare scenario because if the regime crumbles, and it would under American invasion, there is no doubt that Western superiority in the field and in the air would cripple and almost bring to dissolution all of the conventional Iranian army. But we still have the IRGC and militias. All of these could mutiny, and they could spill over into two things: into a civil war and into an insurgency which lasts 20 years. An insurgency which lasts 20 years because it's not looking for victory anymore, but as in the case of other insurgencies which we later saw, its own strategic objective being perpetual resistance. Let's also look at the possibility of an armed uprising inside of Iran, perhaps sparked by a military coup or the IRGC mutiny. This could spill rapidly into a civil war. Iran's multi-ethnic society might fracture. For example, Kurds or the Baloch or the Arabs could seize autonomy in the power vacuum. Some hardliners might fight to the end, as they did in Syria, leading to urban warfare in Tehran and other cities. In this case, massive refugee flows overflow borders, hitting Turkey, Iraq, Azerbaijan, and Central Asia. Global oil prices would skyrocket on the immediate scarcity and insurance risks due to any sort of Hormuz Strait blockage, mining, or interference. External factors would inevitably intervene, not only to fight, but to supply Iran with humanitarian aid. And it is also a possible flashpoint. Russia and China could also move inside Iran to secure key facilities such as nuclear sites or oil fields, and to protect both their nationals and their investments in the country. The broader Middle East could ignite. For instance, Saudi Arabia might consider limited action to counter Iranian chaos, while Iraq, fragile and Shia-dominated, could collapse into a Sunni-Shia war. This outcome could look like a tragic replay of Libya or Syria, decades of conflict with no clear resolution, and even the disintegration of the country into multiple small warlord states, leaving everybody disillusioned and the people of Iran in a horrible spot to be. We are looking at decades of conflict with no clear resolution, leaving terrorism and humanitarian crisis to be the name of the game. Brookings warns that an Iranian collapse would unleash unpredictable, suppressed forces because no planning has been made for the aftermath, and nature abhors a vacuum. In short, the worst-case scenario is a catastrophic breakdown of order, a scenario whose costs far outweigh the benefits. We also have a number of wild cards. We have several X factors, if you will, which could tilt any scenario. We could see a rapid Pahlavi restoration, which is seen with a lot of suspicion inside of Iran. A rapid Pahlavi restoration wouldn't necessarily mean unitary acceptance of this regime, which could also spark a civil war related to the crown. This cannot be fully dismissed if chaos erupts, but Chinese or Russian intervention is also a wild card. Beijing has major oil and infrastructure ties and might send advisors or troops to protect its interests. Moscow might similarly rush assets or push for a friendly successor. Iran might also go federal under pressure, as some Israeli analysts have suggested to The Guardian. Carving out Kurdish or Azeri regions of semi-independent states, transnational jihadist groups are a thing to be worried about in that case. Formerly in Iraq and Syria, they could attempt to insert themselves into Sunni areas of Iran if central control collapses. On the other hand, a moderate cleric within the regime could carry out a palace coup based on Iran's own traditional Khamenei reformist rivalry. This could smooth the transition without bloodshed. Each of these, foreign armies, ethnic secessionists, or unexpected leadership changes, would dramatically change the outcome of the Iranian equation. And now, after this terribly depressing episode, let us head to everybody's favorite segment, the big picture. Revolutions don't just redraw borders, they redraw the logic of power. And if Iran tips, it won't just shake the Islamic Republic. It could crack the very foundation of global stability. We have a number of factors. We have the oil markets, the black vein of global anxiety, if you will. Iran holds roughly 10% of the world's proven oil reserves, a figure that doesn't just make it important, it makes it indispensable. It is the gatekeeper of the Strait of Hormuz, through which 15 to 20% of global oil flows on a daily basis. That's not a pipeline, dear listeners. That is, by any sort of definition, a chokehold. Even whispers of Iranian instability send Brent crude prices soaring. Traders panic. Insurance premiums spike. Refiners in the East Asia region and in Europe start recalculating their margins. If Iran collapses, or worse, if the Strait of Hormuz is closed, we enter uncharted waters. The US would tap into its strategic oil reserves. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates might ramp up production in order to mitigate. But even the best case scenarios lead to months of supply disruption, fuel inflation, and economic blowback from Manila to Madrid to New York. Who are the winners? Well, Russia would be riding the oil price spike and certainly redirect all that new cash to their war efforts in Ukraine. We have the Gulf monarchies, if they can stay insulated, also coming out on top. And we have opportunistic speculators in Geneva or Singapore or wherever, making a ton of money out of the misery of the global markets. And who are the losers, you will ask, dear listeners? Well, the losers, I'm unhappy to say, being an European myself, is the EU, which is already reeling from energy uncertainty and a number of incoherencies in its Green Deal. Then we also have at the losers table India, Japan and South Korea and all energy importing economies. Then we have global oil majors who will be plunged back into sanctions lawyer chaos. One BP executive was overheard saying that if Iran melts down, we're going back to 1973, but this time there's no OPEC meeting to fix it. Regional security and the Shia earthquake is also a factor to take into account. If Iran falls, the ripple will be seismic. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, all publicly triumphant but privately terrified that a weakened Iran sounds good on paper until 10 million Shia refugees show up at your borders. Then we have Iraq, which is already fragile and it could fracture any time on the Libyan model, along sectarian lines which have existed since before anybody can reasonably remember. Iranian allied militias might splinter, leading to Civil War 2.0 in Baghdad. Then we have Afghanistan. Chaos along the eastern border may revive old insurgencies. We have Pakistan, where the Sunni Shia violence could explode, especially in the Baluchistan region. We have Turkey, which faces an ethnic and security nightmare if Iranian Kurds push autonomy and link up with the now pacified PKK, sparking a second insurgency. We have Azerbaijan, who might even eye Iranian Azeri regions for irredentist dreams, which Turkey would fully back, but at the cost of war with a collapsing neighbor. Even Qatar and Oman, historically more neutral, would be forced to pick sides in a regional collapse. And in Lebanon, Syria and Yemen, Iranian proxies such as Hezbollah militias and the Houthi might lash out or implode. What begins as a revolution in Tehran could see the Middle East on fire once more. We also have the global powers facing strategic dilemmas and a sense of historical amnesia. Oh boy, here's where it gets thorny. The US would be caught in a trap, elated at Tehran's fall, but terrified of the vacuum. What do? Do they send troops? Do they send ground advisors? Or repeat the mistakes of Iraq, letting chaos spread uncontained? And ending up, as always, doubling and tripling down in a boots-on-the-ground conflict, bringing neither strategic advantages nor any sort of valor whatsoever. It would be an ugly war. All wars are ugly, but this one would take the cake. Europe would also face another migration wave, surging fuel prices and pressure from Washington to do something. But Europe's appetite for intervention died in Libya. This also needs to be looked at from a European political perspective. Euroscepticism has been the name of the game, and nationalistic populist leaders will certainly exploit any second refugee crisis in order to oust any pro-European politician from power in their native state. Then we have Russia. Having poured assets into Syria with Iran's help, they would not watch passively. Putin or his successor, depending on the time span, could deploy peacekeepers to secure nuclear sites or oil facilities. The chances of a large Russian military intervention is limited if the Ukrainian conflict is going to continue as we expect it to. Then we have China, which tackles a different sort of situation altogether. China is deeply invested in Iranian oil through sanctions evading deals, through the use of the ghost fleet of Iran and ship-to-ship oil transfers in order to avoid sanctions. And China would certainly demand continuity. Beijing's Belt and Road infrastructure and long-term contracts give it leverage, but not immunity to any sort of crisis in Tehran. NATO could find itself facing an identity crisis. Should it defend Hormuz shipping lanes or support an interim Iranian government? Either way, its cohesion will be tested like never before. And before you start yelling at me that there is no legal basis for NATO to intervene because no NATO state was attacked, I will kindly remind you that there are more than one way to skin a cat. And even though it would be de facto NATO, they would call it a coalition of the willing. And when the oil prices hit $120 per barrel, you will see how willing everybody gets. And all of this plays out against the backdrop of a US-China and US-Russia rivalry with Europe in the middle, where Iran becomes not a player but yet another battlefield in a Cold War 2.0, which seems to get far hotter than the original Cold War. Now we also need to look at the comparative lessons of the Arab Spring, and if the Persian Spring would be something worse. Let's not kid ourselves, we've seen the movie before. In Libya, Gaddafi falls and the country fractures into warlord zones. In Syria, peaceful protests metastasize into a genocidal decade of civil war. In Egypt, Mubarak goes and the new strongman takes his place. Western policymakers have long memories, and Macron said it best. Regime change without a plan is not idealism, it's madness. Iran is different, yes. It's not oil poor like Libya. It's not a majority Sunni nation like Syria. And its regime is more coherent and theologically unified than Mubarak's Egypt. But revolutions don't follow scripts, they detonate them. And the Persian Spring could equally elevate moderate clerics, secular reformists, or genocidal madmen. And it could also empower hardline factions, military juntas, or even foreign-backed proxies. There's no guaranteed end to the chaos. only the certainty that it would not be containable. Who are the winners and losers in a post-revolution ledger? Well, that depends whether it stabilizes or not. But let's say that it does. The winners could be secular reformists and technocrats, especially those willing to cut deals with the West. Israel, finally rid of its main ideological enemy. Gulf monarchies, assuming the unrest doesn't spill over. Western oil firms licking their lips at unfreezing contracts and reclaiming fields. And the Iranian people, if they can govern themselves without descending into factionalism and civil war. But this just seems a bit too optimistic for my analyst eye. But I digress. The losers would be the IRGC, stripped of its power and patronage empire. Radical Islamist networks from Hezbollah to the Houthis, Russia and China who lose a partner and face a vacuum, minorities scapegoated in the event of regime collapse, and ordinary Iranians if the revolution becomes a civil war. I believe that this is a way too optimistic scenario, but I am bound to present it to you. This is what a successful and relatively, how shall I put it, to the liking of the West revolution would occur. But let's look at the actual geopolitics of this revolution. A major upheaval in Iran would rattle global oil. Iran sitting on 10% of proven oil reserves as previously mentioned. And its southern ports are gateways to the Gulf crude. Even rumors of Iranian instability push prices up by spooking traders, and the collapse could block the Strait of Hormuz, leaving us without 20% of the world's entire oil flow, forcing emergency supply measures from US reserves or Gulf Arab overproduction. Winners could include other oil exporters, such as Russia or Saudi Arabia, benefiting from higher prices. Then there is the matter of regional security. Iran's neighbors would be profoundly affected in the Persian Gulf, especially, and the Arab monarchies. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Bahrain would feel both relief because of a regional rival finding itself weakened, and the threat because millions of Shia refugees and militant movements would surely arise and head towards the Gulf. Iraq is already unstable and could fracture along sectarian lines as previously mentioned, and Afghanistan and Pakistan might see new cross-border conflicts if militant militias flee the country across the border. Iran is, after all, a paradox. Iran is not just a country, it's a contradiction. An empire with roots in Cyrus, run by men who quote Khomeini, a theocracy with a median age of 33, a civilization of poets and of engineers ruled by censors and enforcers, a society plugged into Instagram and VPN, but policed by men with batons and blindfolds with ideas out of the Middle Ages. Its past is glorious, but its present is brittle, and its future is terrifyingly open. This could spark the Third World War if we are not careful. It all depends on the Iranian people, on the authorities in Tehran, and on the great power politics and how they react. The youth of Iran are ready. The regime is aging, the world is watching, and the stakes are global. Will all this end up in a revolution? Well, empires do not fall in a day. They fall in whispers until they fall in fire. Tonight we've walked the razor's edge of revolution. We've seen the lion rise. We've watched the veil slip. We've heard the silence of blackouts and the roar of missiles in the night. From the courtyards of Persepolis to the satellites orbiting above Qom, from coded whispers in Mashdad to fire on the streets of Zahedan, from the call to prayer to the call to protests, Iran stands at the edge of something vast and terrible, and maybe, just maybe, transformative. But this is not a Hollywood ending, despite my seemingly theatrical rhetoric and manner of speech. This is Realpolitik, and in Realpolitik, victory comes only to those who can survive the aftermath. The question is no longer if the regime is shaking. The question is who dares take its place when it falls, and what demons will ride alongside them. As the world watches Tehran with bated breath, we at Realpolitik Confidential will be here charting the tremors, decoding the lies, and bringing you the truth behind the headlines. Because geopolitics isn't a game, it's a war of perception. And in war, we arm you with clarity. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay lucid, and remember, the world doesn't run on justice, it runs on power. This has been Realpolitik Confidential Episode 7. I was your favorite host, Alex Crișan, and remember our motto: less ideology, more analysis. Stay safe out there, and God bless you all. Good evening.